Previously on the SoJo files. I am going to be reading for you all directly from those reports on what officers claim to have collected what pieces of evidence from November 8th, 2018. To summarize Detective Ware's involvement with evidence collection on November 8th, 2018, Detective Ware collected the two swabs, one from the hallway and one from the dresser in the bedroom, and then he secured Jordan's truck once it arrived at the Van Buren, Arkansas Police Department. And that's it. That's all Detective Ware claims to have collected as far as evidence goes on November 8th, 2018. So as it applies to November 8th, 2018, Detective Marsh is on record saying that he collected the piece of the diaper, the trash bag from the kitchen, the blankets and sheets from the bed in the master bedroom, the bedding and mat from the pack and play, and a yellow pill that was allegedly found under the bedding but on top of the mat in the pack and play, the Arkansas Razorback body pillow, and the EKG strip that was handed to him by Officer Chase DeCrew. And that's it. That's all the evidence. To sum up evidence collection from the crime scene November 8th, 2018 in its totality, we have a swab taken from possible blood in the hallway, a swab taken from possible blood on a dresser from the master bedroom, Jordan's truck, the EKG strip, the fabric cut from the couch cushion that had possible blood on it with no detail on who collected it, the piece of the diaper, the onesie with no detail on who collected it, the pill, the trash bag from the kitchen, the bedding and mat from the pack and play, the blankets and sheets from the master bed, the Arkansas Razorback body pillow, the iPhone from the half bath, and a clear trash sack of gloves and other items with no detail on who collected those. And that's it. That is the totality of evidence collection for the homicide of a 2-year-old on November 8th, 2018. On this week's episode of the SoJo Files, we are going to be taking an in-depth look at the EKG strip from November 8th, 2018. And the best part is you have the whole crew here to discuss the EKG strip today. So you've got, of course, me, SoJo, as well as the other host of Season 2, which also happened to be Jordan's defense team. So you have, of course, Chad Atwell, Chris Carwile, and his sister, Laura Carwile. So let's dive into the EKG strip. When the defense initially put in for discovery on this case, and if you don't know, discovery is when the defense gets all of the information and evidence that the police and prosecution have against their client. So here for the Shreeve case, when they put in for discovery, they received a copy of one EKG strip. And the EKG strip that the defense was provided had something that caught their interest. And I'll let Laura get into that.
I'm not sure if it was a tear or if it had been folded over. From my memory, there was something about the copy that made it clear we didn't have access to the middle part of the strip. And that was confirmed by a friend who looked at it and said, yeah, this is not a continuous strip.
So the defenses provided this copy of an EKG strip that is either torn or folded, and that piqued your interest and made you think that you needed to contact somebody with a medical background to ask them if this was normal or if it seemed abnormal.
I called her to see if our gut check about there being something wrong with it was correct, and she confirmed our suspicion that it was clearly not a continuous EKG strip and that it appeared that something had been cut out of the middle in some way by someone. And that was obviously very concerning.
As if being provided an EKG strip that is either folded or torn, but either way incomplete, and you already had your suspicions confirmed about that, there's actually a surprise waiting for you all at the Van Buren Police Department as it applies to the EKG strip, correct?
So my memory of that is that in trial prep, with all the rest of the shenanigans lining up what everybody said they collected on the 8th, well, I know in April of 21, when we went, and Chris and I and Billy Turnbow and his assistant sat in the Van Buren evidence room and opened and photographed everything in preparation for trial.
Side note that Billy is a retired police officer who now is a private investigator, and he is the private investigator that was hired by Chad, Chris, and Laura to work for the defense on the Shreeve case, and you all will be hearing from him later on.
That's when we saw an actual EKG strip in plastic that had a spike on it. That wasn't the first time in this case that we went, what the hell is going on? But it was yet another thing.
I mean, I think we realized something was up, but we didn't know exactly what. Like, it could, right, this could be folded and just, it could be straight all the way across.
You all just knew what copy you guys were provided in discovery for this case, and then while you're at the Van Buren Police Department going through evidence anyways, you see a copy and just happen to notice that, yeah, this copy doesn't look like the copy that we were provided in discovery.
That's right. The spike was what was cut out, or what appeared to be missing from the first one that I saw, which is why we checked in with someone who knew how to read EKG strips, who told us it didn't look continuous. And we realized at some point that there was a spike missing that was conveniently the only part of the EKG strip we had first been provided that was missing.
Ironically, it wasn't. The one in evidence at Van Buren is not folded like that.
That's right.
So don't forget that there are two different EKG strips.
Just to be crystal clear for the listeners so that they can try to keep up with all of this fuckery, you guys are provided an EKG strip in discovery that has either a tear or a fold, doesn't matter, either way, incomplete. Then, when you go to the Van Buren Police Department to review the evidence for this case, you happen to see an EKG strip in plastic wrap, and you notice that that strip doesn't look like the strip that you all were provided, and then come to find out it's an entirely different EKG strip than the one you all were provided.
At a morbid level, we never disputed that Olivia was dead. So I don't know that I paid that much attention to the EKG strip until April the 29th or whatever that day was we went down there. And then we saw the one that you have that photograph of that's in plastic and pristine. And the moment, that Chris and I saw that, Billy, holding these things up, went, that is not what we have been looking at that's in our file. What the hell is going on? And it doesn't really matter the rest of it, that there are two, that they're not the same, and that both exist, right? And only one is in evidence. That's it, really, from an analysis standpoint.
Besides the fact that obviously the copy of the EKG strip that y'all were provided is a flat line that's either torn or folded, and the fact that the one in evidence is in pristine condition, no fold, no crease, no tear, and has a bump on it, which clearly and very obviously is not what you all were provided, what about the strips, for the sake of the listeners, proved that they were two different EKG strips? And not just that they altered and removed the bump from the strip that they provided you, which that in and of itself is fucking crazy.
The problem with the one in the bottom, though, SoJo, is what I'm about to show you. And this, probably for my lifetime, will not be the last thing that I have to say about the EKG strip. But look at the time on the one that's folded, and look at the time on this one. By way of reference, I'm showing her what's been marked as Atwell Charade Exhibit 1,746,000, and it is the pristine copy that is in evidence. It is time-stamped 13:27 and 37 seconds. Could you please read the time from the bottom when it appears folded and or torn?
13:26:48.
Yeah, it might as well be a 9mm and a 40 cal, because here's the thing, if it's not the same, it's different. If it's different, why in the hell is it different? These aren't copies. This isn't a carbon copy of something. It's a different EKG strip.
Two completely different EKG strips. It's not just that they look different. One's a flat line, one has a bump, one is torn or folded, and one is in pristine condition. You have two EKG strips taken at two completely different times.
But also, the one that occurred first in time at 126 and change is folded or torn so that the line appears flat. Then, a passage of time, it's irrelevant what that is, there's one with a bump. These aren't the same EKG strip. I'm going to say this again. I'll stand in a ring and take all comers. These are different EKG strips.
The copy that you all were provided in discovery, the only copy that you all were provided in the initial discovery, is not the one, obviously, in evidence. Where is y'all's copy, and why did they not have that on file in evidence? And why weren't you guys provided the copy that they do have on file in evidence? Make it make sense.
A way to explain it might be that what we were provided initially from the Van Buren prosecutor's office was a photograph or photocopy of what appears to be a folded or torn EKG strip. And since we were provided that photograph or photocopy cannot be found in the evidence log, it can't be found in response to a subpoena from EMS. It's unclear who took that picture, where it came from, what it's taking a photograph of. And then what's actually in evidence is a completely different looking EKG strip that appears to be complete. The picture we were provided doesn't appear anywhere else in this case.
There were two done. There's no other way to interpret the data. Look, if they were 2 hours apart or an hour apart, I'd be like, cool, maybe it's a reprint time. These are inside of 2 minutes apart, but they're not the same.
Which led to you all trying to figure out who else had this copy of the EKG strip that you all had not been provided and had never seen before, up until you yourself discovered it at the Van Buren Police Department in evidence.
And then that led us, the next day, the state begged, pleaded, and lied and got a continuance. And so with the extra time, which was Jordan's speedy trial time, then we sent subpoenas to everybody. And at that time, I think that's when the EMS company turned over what they had.
Reluctantly.
Chris spent the majority of the time talking to the EMS company down in Van Buren. They got squirrely all of a sudden when they figured out what the subpoenas were about and were going to be compelled to come. And then my memory is that the EKG strip, along with another interesting piece, were then produced to us.
Did you ever confront them about the fact that the only EKG strip that they have in evidence is an EKG strip that you guys had never seen before and were not provided in discovery?
We didn't confront EMS about it. Their role was pretty limited. We confronted the prosecutors on this case about all of the things that you've already talked about and about all the things we're going to talk about and about all the things in the motions we filed. And there was never any response from them. So confronting anybody with anything was just going to be settled at trial. I think anyone that has met me will tell you, with a long track record or short, I will give people the benefit of the doubt on whatever it is. It doesn't matter if I know the topic or the subject or the score of the game or whatever, but I'm done with benefit of the doubt when it comes to the fucking prosecutor's office and the Van Buren Police Department and the Crawford County Sheriff's Office in State v. Jordan Shreeve. Every single time. I added a lawyer, I sent requests. I added another lawyer, both of them better than me, but every single time, the responses became non-existent. You know why the crickets stopped chirping? Because they knew that the jig would soon be up. And that's why.
I feel like I can say with full confidence that the jig was up before it ever even started. Just looking at this case, I don't know how anybody could look at this and think that they had a case against Jordan. They never had any kind of case against Jordan ever.
Well, they should have laid down their arms then and went home, and they should have prosecuted Eva Millard, and they should have done some investigative work because there was a dead 2-year-old.
So, like, to put it in perspective, the EKG strip is important because it can sort of give you a range as to how long the person has been dead, right? That's my understanding of it somewhat. If there's a pulse, or if there's a, I don't know what the words are, recent like electrical activity, isn't that what it measures? What does the EKG strip measure? That, basically. And so if there was any activity on it, it would suggest that Olivia had been alive more recently than 4 a.m.
Did anyone ever check to see if it was just a false read because maybe someone bumped the EKG machine or something like that?
That's part of also why I called the friend of mine who works as a pediatric hospitalist. And she said just what you just said, which is you know, there are multiple reasons an EKG will bounce like that. It could be, to your point, that someone hit the machine, right? Or there's a false read for 1 second or something to that effect. There's no real way to tell years later exactly what caused it. You know, that's a legitimate explanation, right? Maybe someone hit the EKG machine and it bounced up once. But I think the nefarious part was the fact that when we were given this strip readout, they had cut it out. And maybe there's an innocent explanation for that, right? I mean, we just thought of a few. But the fact that they cut it out made it seem even more suspicious. And we didn't have the ability to research it very much because by the time we had it, we were close to starting trial and I was calling in favors rather than being able to go to an expert and have them explain it. And I think that was one of the reasons that they kept the information from us, is so we didn't have these questions in front of the jury.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the phrase "they kept this information from us" applies with intent across the board to many things in this case, but I think that image of the EKG strip is absolutely one of them, because I think it should give a prosecutor questions. It certainly is something that they should talk to somebody in the medical field about, just like we did.
And if they bumped it by accident and it caused it to spike, then just say that. That's not nefarious. Accidents happen. No big deal. There's no reason to hide that if that's really all that it was. Who provided you with the first discovery that had the defense's copy of the EKG strip that doesn't exist anywhere else?
This was disclosed to in the initial disclosure from now Circuit Judge Mark McEwen. This photograph that you have on the bottom that appears to be flat. The upper one is from a photograph that we took.
So where is y'all's copy if it's not in evidence?
I think that's a great question. I have no idea. I have no idea where that photograph came from. That photograph doesn't exist. It was turned over in discovery. That photograph doesn't exist in a FOIA disclosure from Van Buren Police Department for every single photograph related to this case.
Knowing that there are two completely different EKG strips that exist, and only one exists in the defense's discovery and nowhere else, and the one that's in evidence at the Van Buren Police Department was not handed over to the defense, I think we need to discuss the chain of custody for the EKG strip. Because theoretically, right, the chain of custody should be a record of everyone that ever touched or handled that piece of evidence. And we know from the police reports that DeCrew actually took possession of the EKG strip from EMS and then handed it over to Detective Marsh. But as far as the chain of custody goes, it just says Detective Marsh to Christy Davidson, who is the evidence tech for the Van Buren Police Department.
Yeah. And I think I remember sitting down with Chad one time, and after we had gone through the evidence list, and at some point, I think it was him or one of us said, it's just all fucked up. Every single piece of evidence is fucked up. Go back to what Laura said. And it's true. If you look at any single piece of evidence, you can find something wrong with either how it was collected, or how it was entered into evidence, or how it was recorded or written down in a report or something. There's something wrong with almost every single piece of evidence.
But how are we just gonna pretend like they didn't provide the defense with a copy of an EKG strip that's damaged, 1, and doesn't exist anywhere else, 2, and is not the one that we have on file in evidence, 3. We're just going to pretend like that just didn't happen. We're not going to address that at all.
They didn't introduce, I mean, I know we're not going to jump forward, but they never had anybody actually see either of those.
They never introduced either into evidence at trial.
But also it goes to show the lengths. Like, this piece of evidence isn't one of the most important pieces in the case for the prosecution or the defense, really. It's just, it possibly injects doubt into the proceedings, and that's why they hid it from us. Even though it's not, they hid everything from us. They manipulated every piece of evidence they gave us because, and even the small things. And that sort of goes to show how, I don't know the word to use, how evil it was.
But look, right, let's back up for a moment as we talk about the 8th and this case and pretend that everybody's intentions were innocent and pure. At a bare minimum, in a murder case, the defense is going to question everything because you have to, but the state should question why it appears to be that there are 2 different EKG strips, or at minimum, one that doesn't look like the other one, and why does defense counsel have something different? That's a big deal, especially, and Laura was a prosecutor for a while, right? And so I'm not going to go to trial as a prosecutor and be surprised by someone shoving that in my face. It doesn't appear very well outwardly when those things happen.
Oh, I know that you left nothing to the realm of possibility of catching you off guard or by surprise in the Shreeve case.
We have every other incident report from November the 8th, 2018 in our case file.
I forgot about that. Yeah, that was painful.
You're welcome.
It was fun. It was a really fun week, but it was.
Listen, but that's what we did for everything that purportedly, denotedly, or whatever verb you want to use was collected as evidence on November the 8th, is that we had to send subpoenas and FOIAs and go dig and go look and go cross-reference and create our own case file from scratch.
We've already talked about how it was pretty ridiculous that they would hide it like this because it has an explanation that doesn't hurt their case. But the fact that they were willing to hide it at first suggests that they felt they needed to hide everything because they were hiding a bigger issue, right? They didn't know if that was going to uncover their corruption. So they had to hide that strip part from us because what if that could prove that their story was false? So I think that might be why a lot of this evidence came to us manipulated or hidden. My guess is they didn't really know what could get them caught. And this could have been it. And so for every piece of evidence we got, there was something wrong with it because they were trying to hide a bigger story.
Yeah. We also, Chad and I came to the conclusion, I think it was when we were driving back from looking at all the evidence on the 29th. And we were talking in the truck, and we came to the conclusion that if you had messed something up, or you were trying to hide something, if you were trying to hide something, you would fuck everything up. Because if everything was fucked up, then the one obvious fuck up you had wouldn't be as obvious. So it kind of gets hidden because the whole thing's a mess. So you don't even know what to look at. Even things that don't matter are a mess. And so the non-intentional screw-ups kind of get hidden.
There's always room for human error, right? We're all human. We all make mistakes. Shit happens. However, this is too much to be considered human error or mistakes that could be expected or forgiven because shit happens. I don't think there's a way to look at this and the amount of shit that happened and not conclude that it has to be nefarious in some way, shape, or form. It's just simply not possible to look at this and say this is all human error.
Yeah, no,
Exactly.
It can't all be human error.
No, absolutely not. And if it was just a few things here and there, sure, okay, human error. But when it is literally everything from start to finish, and I do mean literally everything from start to finish, the 911 calls, we got issues with dispatch and the CAD notes. Then we have issues at the crime scene as far as the crime scene log goes, when people came and went and who all was there and not there and who's not shown on it, but we'll get into that later. Issues with the dash cam footage from DeCruz's car that Eva Millard was sitting in. You've got issues with the interrogations, with evidence collection on the scene that day. There are literally issues from the fucking 911 call all the way up to trial, and that is just simply not statistically possible.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think it's important because it kind of shows that, like on something that doesn't hurt their case, they still won't respond to us about it when we ask them about it. And they won't, hear our concerns, and they won't do anything. Even on something like this. So it kind of gives you insight into, well, what about on something that matters? Would they hear you out? Would they really listen to you? No, probably not. Once they have their case, they're going to go with that.
Well, also, I mean, to your point about statistically impossible to have this many accidents, how is it that just the one part of the EKG strip that has relevant information is the thing that's folded over, right? I mean, that EKG strip is long, and somehow the only part that has some interest to us is the thing that's hidden. That also feels almost impossible that was an accident.
No, and who put the perfect, pristine copy and evidence and left out the copy that was provided to the defense? Like, where is that?
Who the hell knows?
I feel like medical documentation from the victim of a homicide should not go missing.
I mean, I assure you, I'm guessing the only place that one that is folded or torn exists anymore is Jordan Shreeve's case file that was generated by this law firm and all the people that worked on this case. Now, look, what is in evidence down at Van Buren Police Department? And we need to, I think, slide back to the 8th, but there are things in evidence at the Van Buren Police Department that are in a box next to the EKG strip, which I've never seen put in evidence before. The search warrants affidavits in this case, those are in evidence. And Van Buren Police, they have them in a protective plastic folder. And unless California does it different, I don't know why in the hell the pleadings and things that are file marked would be in evidence, and Van Buren treats them as evidence. And it's the first time I have ever seen that as defense counsel who has gone through many rooms full of evidence, or as a prosecutor who has introduced them. And I'd love to hear Laura's thoughts on that.
I've never seen that done. I completely agree with Chad. It makes no sense why a file stamped copy of something that's supposed to go on the docket, or that's some kind of paperwork from the DA's office, would find its way into an evidence room. I can't even answer what they were thinking there, because it makes absolutely no sense. Maybe they're trying to hide something there so that we don't see it. Maybe there's, I don't know. Chad would be better at guessing as to why, but you never see that happen.
I'll weigh in. It's because of a thing that Billy Turnbow, the investigator, said to Chris and I one time, which is cops that, I don't remember. How do you say it, Chris? Do you remember this?
You're going to have to remind me, and then I'll remember.
Basically, long story short, by the way, that was just worthless on your part, Chris. But, cops that lie, they still get a pension. Cops that destroy evidence, they go to jail. The only reason to keep half of the things that Van Buren has logged as evidence, regardless of what date or year they logged it in this case, is because it is evidence. But it may not be against Jordan Shreeve, but it's being kept. And that is the only thing I have ever come up with that fits with what I have seen in evidence at Van Buren Police Department. Full stop.
That is exactly what he said, Bob. I do remember it now that you said, yeah. That's exactly what he said.
Thanks for weighing in, Chris.
Yeah, no, there's my 2 cents.
That leads us back to the issue of chain of custody, which, of course, on the chain of custody log, they only mention one EKG strip, and obviously we know there is clearly more than one, but I digress. On the chain of custody for the EKG strip, it says that on November 12th, 2018, Wesley Marsh dropped off the EKG strip into the evidence locker at the Van Buren Police Department. And then on November 29th, 2018, Christy Davidson accepted the EKG strip into evidence. Regardless, the point is that sometime between November 8th, 2018 and November 29th, 2018, when Christy Davidson accepted it into evidence at the Van Buren Police Department, somebody pulled a switcheroo or decided they were only going to submit one EKG strip into evidence.
All right, can I pause you for a minute?
Yeah.
Can I do that? Mm-hmm. I mean, you do it to me all the time.
Yeah,
Lord knows Laura and Chris have, and that's what makes all this work. But listen, here's what we know. Here is factual information rather than supposition, is that at least as of all of the Jordan Shreeve report, an officer goes and sits down at their computer. They type in, for lack of a better term, they type in EKG strip, enter. They don't have to do anything with that strip at that moment in time, or that shoe, or that bloody knife. They just type in entered. These reports then will generate the time that they say, I entered this into evidence. Now, the second date that you see in those chain of custody reports is the only thing that has any version, a little bit, of validity. And that is when Christy Davidson, in the one-way lockers in the sealed evidence room, lays hands on a thing. Then she types in on her end, received. And then look at the difference in those dates.
The chain of custody log has Detective Marsh putting the EKG strip into the one-way evidence locker on November 12th, 2018, which is 4 days after the homicide. And it shows Christy Davidson as accepting it on the 29th, which is obviously 21 days after the homicide, and 17 days, over 2 weeks, after Marsh allegedly put it into the one-way locker in the evidence room. And since we're pointing out the little things that aren't so little, are we not going to mention that theoretically the chain of custody for this piece of evidence should mention that Officer DeCrew gave that to Detective Marsh, who then submitted it to the evidence locker for Christy Davidson to take possession of. He's completely left off the chain of custody, and I feel like since he touched the evidence, and they even admitted that on both of their reports for the day, that should be mentioned and reflected on the chain of custody.
So, yes, in a perfect world, they would be memorialized. Typically, I'm not going to see, EMS, right? This is all sort of lowest common denominator for software. So, but you should see EMS, right? Marsh would type that in. EMS hands it to Chase DeCrew, right? And then Marsh, or at bare minimum, if maybe their system only allows you, right, as the collecting officer or however you want to phrase it. But they have a whole subsection, as we know, of case notes. And so in a case note, you would put, with regard to, E37 or E12, this item was handed from Joe Bob with Central EMS to Corporal Chase DeCrew. I took possession of it from Chase DeCrew. I put it in a locker on this date, and that's how it ought to be.
But the collecting officer would be Chase DeCrew, because Chase DeCrew, in the capacity of an officer for the Van Buren Police Department, took possession of the EKG strip from presumably EMS, and then he, as an officer for the Van Buren Police Department, transferred custody of that EKG strip to another officer, being Detective Marsh, with the Van Buren Police Department.
But they don't keep a record of who collected any piece of evidence at all, not just the EKG. But
they're supposed to, right?
Yes,
ideally, but they don't. They don't.
We learned, and again, I know we're not talking about trial at this point, but it turned out that is exactly right. No one took any log of where something was found or who took initial possession of it from the scene, which Chad has already introduced me as someone from California, and I worked in the California law enforcement system for a long time. And when I heard that, I was absolutely stunned. I mean, the idea that they don't take a record of who took it initially, other than whatever the officer feels like writing in their report, is absolutely wild to me. And I think that's that's a good point as to all of this evidence. Like, it's not just this EKG strip. We had no idea. We had no record to confront anyone with or to learn where something had been found because they just didn't document that.
Which is absolute bullshit.
Yeah.
It is.
You documented on the report that someone else touched it. You have to reflect that in the chain of custody, period. The end.
That's because it has taken me 4 years to be as comfortable as I am with the fucking word charade when it comes to this investigation. I don't use that word lightly. I've beaten people before when facts were not in my client's favor. I've outworked them. There are a lot of things that I will say about things, but this is one of exactly 2 cases in my career that I will use the word charade, and this one is by far the worst. And report writing, if nothing else, whether Wesley Marsh actually graduated from college or not is a whole nother episode, but he did at least at some point maybe, go to a 6-week academy. They teach report writing, right? If you back up and read his report in half speed again, you have to take it quite literally. If it doesn't say I collected, you can bet your ass he didn't collect it. Because when you compare it to Jonathan Ware's, right, and Daniel Perry's, well, now we're out. Because the only people, based off my memory, I want whoever listens to this to understand I'm not looking at anything, I'm looking at SoJo. The only reports that say I or it was, in terms of collected, are, I believe, Chase DeCruz vaguely references maybe the EKG, but maybe that was Wooten's. Jonathan Ware says, I collected. Actually, Jonathan Ware's is another one. I'm not going to go too deep into it. But swabs were collected, and they were put in his car. Full stop. And then he was out, by the way. And then I left. I left. Wesley Marsh's lists about 4 things, perhaps, that say I collected. Otherwise, it's passive. Blah, 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 was collected. And that's the end of reports that indicate collection of evidence on November the 8th. Chris, is that right?
Yeah. No one wants to take credit for collecting most of the stuff.
I want you to start keeping a mental list of Chad Atwell's words. Charade, preservation of this charade, which exists at the Van Buren Police Department in the form of pleadings and orders and search warrants. They list as evidence. And then start thinking about that in terms of, why doesn't someone say, I collected? Why is it we, or it was, or this thing, or somehow it appeared in our evidence locker? Why are these things true, and do they fit together? Because at some point, when me and Chris and Laura all started talking about these things in terms of math, because that doesn't play well at my house, by the way, I'm kind of a math dork, but the statistical probability of these, what would be an anomaly in the rest of my decade plus, I'll leave it at that, of the practice of law, right? These anomalies, they're popping up like mushrooms after a rainstorm in this case. It is not statistically probable for all of those events and reports and otherwise to exist by accident in State v. Shreeve.
I agree, and I don't know what's worse. Either you really are this incompetent, which, again, is absolutely statistically impossible, or you did exactly what I think that you did, and it's as corrupt as it looks. I don't know which one's worse.
Nobody's this stupid. There's nobody this stupid, right? This report goes through 2 supervisors, and this one, by the way, went through at least 2 supervisors. At least. Every piece of this report.
Also, someone who's just stupid wouldn't be canny enough to hide who collected something and how something was collected, right? If they're stupid, maybe they, write it some other way. But if they're studiously writing in the passive voice, this was collected, this was found, because they know that to write what actually happened would uncover their corruption. I don't think you can be stupid and do that.
I think Laura's 100% correct, and I think that goes back to the math side of it. Chris once told me when he was still trying to digest all of this, he said it's almost as if it is designed to appear stupid and incompetent. And you know what?
Yeah.
I think that's right. We do know, because we do have every incident report, every call out from the 8th and the 9th. We have them all. We have all of them. We do know that somewhere around 1:30 on November the 8th, Scotty Wooten went where, Chris?
To the Van Buren Police Department.
There's another stop for Scotty Wooten. Scotty Wooten, approximately the time on the EKG strip, went where, Chris, by way of address?
Oh, God.
Dear Lord.
Blanking.
Lord, that's enough context for you to beat him to the punch.
I know.
EKG strip, time, an hour later. Why I don't care about fall back, fall forward, because I have a report indicating an address where Scotty Wooten was around 1:30 on November the 8th. And it wasn't Granite Circle. I'll tell you what, here's a hint then. Here's a hint for everybody. Again, I want it to be noted because I'm getting old, but I have no report in front of me. I have zero. I'm looking right at SoJo. Google the address for the EMS company that was called out to Granite Circle, and then I'll email you the incident reports and the call-outs for Scotty Wooten around 1:30 on November the 8th, 2018. And guess what you're going to match up? Matchy. EMS. So maybe it was fall back, maybe it was fall forward, maybe it was reprint, maybe it was first print. Hell if I know. I don't even care anymore because it's a charade. To exist. Why?
Well, they very clearly did not want you all to see the EKG strip that had the bump in it. But again, if you just bump the machine and it's a non-nefarious accident that caused a misreading, then it's irrelevant. Why hide it?
It's irrelevant on its own, but it might not be relevant when you combine it with another piece of evidence that was later discovered.
I think that's a great way to put it. I think there are multiple pieces, ideas, or plans involved in State v. Shreeve. All of them ended with we're going to prosecute an innocent guy, but I don't know that all of the architects are the same. And I think they have their own reasons.
I just fucking love that when it comes to figuring out who the architects of this whole situation are in the Shreeve case, no one in this room has left any stone unturned, especially y'all with the FOIA request, and I am living for it.
Every single incident report the Van Buren Police Department wrote on November the 8th, 2018. Stuff totally unrelated, starting from 3 o'clock in the morning to 10 p.m. at night. We have every single incident report.
And dispatch log from every single call out on November the 8th.
Find it all up.
And November the 9th. We have all of it. But I can tell you something else. I know we're talking about November the 8th evidence. Well, I have a lot of November the 8th evidence. Chris and I and Laura, we collected this, right? Well, I mean, again, Van Buren PD wasn't dispatched out there on the 8th. It was one of 5 or 6 medical calls to 911. And on all of them, fire and EMS were toned out. And on none of the rest of them did a cop show up, just by way of mathematical probabilities.
I have one more question that your audience might want to ponder, which is why a police department might get rid of an EKG strip that they've in some way manipulated, and why it doesn't find its way into the evidence room, but maybe where else it could find its way into, for instance, a shredder or something to that effect. Because if we had found the original EKG strip that we have a photograph of, and we saw that it was, for instance, torn and taped back together or folded, we would have had a lot more ammunition rather than just guesses about what happened. So you might want to ask yourself, who had motive to get rid of that first EKG strip and the way it was presented to us?
And cut.
That's a wrap for the EKG strip, and we will see you guys next week.